In this module, we looked at the theoretical tradition of queer theory, which, as I mentioned, is a complex and somewhat challenging theory to unpack, especially in 2 weeks in a sociology of sexuality course. Although some scholars have argued that queer theory extends beyond any set definition, Fitzgerald and Grossman have talked about queer theory as a critical analysis of the social construction of sexuality, particularly a critique of the sexual binary and the notion of essentialism. Queer theory opposes gender and sexuality classifications as limiting and instead embraces the concepts of gender and sexuality as fluid or in flux. The materials for this week also provided us with a historical context for queer theory, which emerged in the 1990s, a time period when we did see an increase in gay and lesbian studies in colleges and universities, but these new areas of study still existed within a traditional academic structure. During this time, there was also a number of voices that were beginning to be heard that were critiquing the gay liberation movement of the 1970s and the identity politics associated with this movement, saying that the movement was incredibly masculine and there was a masculine bias to it, that many sexual minorities, including lesbians and trans folks, felt excluded from the movement. There was also during the 1990s a new interest in post structural examinations of networks of power and identity, and an increase in activist movements, especially among people of color, those interested in AIDS and HIV activism, and post colonialism. Thus, queer theory emerged as a response to earlier identity politics and represented both a continuation and a break with earlier discourses related to sexual minorities. We talked about how, despite the ambiguity of queer and queer theory, most scholars argue that queer theory is made up of three interrelated projects: refusing heterosexuality as the benchmark for sexual formations, challenging sexual binaries. For example, even within gay and lesbian studies, there's not a single entity, but a number of different experiences. And of course, looking at intersectionality. In addition to looking at the three interrelated projects of queer theory, we also looked at a number of queer concepts that have been important in our exploration of human sexuality in recent years. This includes bringing attention to heteronormativity and how it functions in society, moving from politics of sexual identity to politics of sexual difference, and of course, again, stressing intersectionality when we're talking about sexual minorities, sexual oppression, and sexual inequality. The reading this week by Nikki Sullivan provided us with a diversity of different queer perspectives and important queer theorists. From a sociological perspective, there's three important queer theorists that we need to keep in mind, especially as we move forward in the semester to talk about sexual identities, behaviors, and inequalities. The first, of course, is Michel Foucault, who we've talked about multiple times so far this semester. Foucault argued that sexuality is a discursive production that's created by societies to control population. Gail Rubin is another important queer theorist who argued that sexual identities and behaviors are organized in a hierarchy through a system of sexual classification, ultimately leading to sexual stratification, where those at the top have the most access to power, privilege, and resources, and those at the bottom have the least. It's also important to consider the work of Judith Butler, who argued that gender and sexuality is acted out. It's portrayed and performed as reality, as opposed to actually being biological or part of an essential drive. In wrapping up this week's content, I highlighted some of the key implications of queer theory. Not only that queer theory undermines the base structure of identity politics, but that it illustrates that sexuality cannot be disconnected from other categories of social status and identity. We highlighted how queer theory questions how sexuality shapes and is shaped by other factors, and illustrated the way in which queer theory illuminates the benefits of interdisciplinary scholarship. The readings for this week both explored queer theory. Sullivan had a very detailed exploration of the social, theoretical, and political conditions that led to the emergence of queer theory. She also explored how the term queer has been understood and the implications of queer as both a term and a theoretical frame. Sullivan's reading covered many of the various topics that we looked at in the mini lectures this week, including the exploration of the politics of the gay liberation movement and how the category of sexual identity was viewed as both limited and limiting. Of course, Sullivan also explored the post structuralist notions of power, knowledge, and identity, and then looked at how queer and the refusal to define what queer is emerged from both within and outside the academy, ultimately arguing that queer exists as an opposition to a supposedly normative other. The reading by Kathleen Fitzgerald and Candace Grossman also looked at post-structuralism and queer theory, but in a little bit more condensed version. In this reading, we see queer theory as really a part of a social constructionist approach to understanding sex and sexuality that both questions power dynamics and explores variation. For your final thoughts this week, I'd like you to reflect on the following. What is queer? And how can we apply elements of queer theory into our exploration of sexual identities, behaviors, and inequality? In exploring this final question, think of an example, something that we can consider as we move forward this semester.